Well, hello. My name is Kevin Woyce. I'm an author and a photographer here in Lyndhurst, New Jersey, and speaking to you today about the history that took place in and around New Jersey's state parks. One of the books I've written is called New Jersey State Parks, History and Facts. And people have asked me what got me interested in researching, writing, and speaking about the state parks. And the fact is, I grew up here in New Jersey. I've lived here my whole life. So we all know how people outside of New Jersey sometimes see our state. They think of an urban landscape, an industrial landscape, maybe a tangle of highways. And there are times it's not hard to see why they think that. I took this picture just a few blocks from my home. That's the Route 3 bridge heading over the Passaic River. But there is another side to New Jersey, and that's the one I'd like to talk about today. We have 28 state parks here in New Jersey, and that's counting just the places that are called something state park. It doesn't include, say, the state forests or other natural or historic sites run by the state, or any of the national, county, or local parks. The waterfall on the screen is located in Hacklebarney State Park. And part of what makes New Jersey so much fun to explore is that even though we have one of the smaller states, these parks cover such a wide range of territory. So, for example, in the northwestern part of the state, you've got parks up in the mountains surrounding lakes, including this one, which is located in Kittatinny Valley State Park, just south of Newton. And throughout the program, I will be putting a map on the screen to give you at least a rough idea where some of these parks are located. Now, the name Kittatinny meant endless mountain in the language of New Jersey's very first settlers. Not the British, not even the Dutch, but the Lenni Lenape. They migrated in from the Northwest between 8,000 and 10,000 years ago. So they've been here so long, their name translates as the original people. And Kittatinny, or Endless Mountain, is what the Lenape called the Appalachians. The highest of those mountains here in New Jersey is a little over 1,800 feet. The peak overlooks Lake Marcia. The state geologist named the lake back in 1855, named it after his fiancée. But the area around the lake got a much better known name in 1888 when Charles St. John, businessman in Port Jervis, New York, made his fortune in the lumber industry. He bought the property around the lake and then built a resort hotel up above the lake shore facing New Jersey's highest peak. So he called it the Inn at High Point. The property was sold again in 1910 to businessman, naturalist, philanthropist Anthony Cooser. He was on the board of directors of more than 50 companies, so he bought this enormous property as a summer estate, renamed the inn Cooser Lodge. Sadly, the building is no longer standing, but for many years it would serve as a museum and the park office, because in 1923, he gave the property to the state and it would become High Point State Park. Well, there was one condition on this gift. I mentioned he was a naturalist. He was very interested in birds. He funded expeditions to the Far East to study the birds there. So when he gave the property to the state, it was on the condition that there was to be no bird hunting allowed within the park. 5 years later, 1928, he put up another $500,000 to build a monument at the top of High Point. It's made of granite, over 200 feet tall, and it's modeled after the monument at Bunker Hill up in Massachusetts. Very popular attraction in the 1930s. They'd get as many as 350,000 visitors a year there. And back then it was 25 cents admission, 10 cents for children. The tower is dedicated to all of New Jersey's war veterans, and it was also built with a practical purpose in mind. If you look at the top of the tower, you can see there's a window on each side. After dark, they would turn on a powerful beacon inside. It would shine through those windows. Airplane pilots could see the light from quite a distance, and they would use it to figure out where they were, and from there, how to plot a course to the nearest airports. From the top of the tower when it's open, or just from the top of High Point, which is where I was when I took this picture, you get great views of large parts of New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania. High Point is our second largest state park, more than 15,000 acres. But our largest is more than twice that size, more than 30,000. In fact, Wayway State Park is so big, several miles of the Appalachian Trail run across it. And when I first started researching the parks, told friends of mine what I was doing, one of their first questions was, "Are you going to tell us what Wayway means?" Well, of course I will. That name is another gift of the Lenape, who lived in those mountains. They originally gave the name to a river, so it meant something like winding water or wandering river. Later settlers also gave the name to the mountain and to this lake. But nobody ever got so creative when it came to naming the two islands in the lake. Those are still known as the Twin Islands. But back in 1886, the YMCA chose one of them as the site of their first summer camp. The camp has moved a bunch of times since then. It's been located in the Catskill Mountains of New York since the 1950s. But back when the YMCA was using the island, campers got out there in little ferry boats that were pulled across the lake with ropes. So the parks here in New Jersey range from these high mountains and lakes to one of my favorite parts of the state, and that's the seacoast, Jersey Shore, where we have 4 state parks. 2 of those are built around historic lighthouses. And I will drive almost anywhere to visit and photograph a lighthouse. And if it's open to the public, I'm climbing that spiral stairway to the top to get some pictures from up there. So you've got Barnegat Light State Park, where the tower they've nicknamed Old Barney overlooks the last patch of coastal forest on Long Beach Island. The name fits. It is the longest island on the shore, about 18 miles. And then down at the southern tip of the state, you've got the lighthouse in Cape May Point State Park. It's also still in use, built the same year as Old Barney, 1859. And if you climb the spiral stairway to the top, it's 199 steps. When you get up there, you can look out over the beaches and trails and wetlands of the state park. On the beach, you can also see the remains of a concrete gun battery built during World War II to defend the approaches to Delaware Bay. Looking to the north, you can see the city of Cape May. You can see the wildwoods. I've also been told that on the very clearest days, looking to the south, you can see all the way across the mouth of Delaware Bay to Cape Henlopen State Park in southern Delaware. I've yet to climb the tower on a day quite that clear. But because Cape May Point is on a narrow strip of land between the Atlantic Ocean and Delaware Bay, it's a stopping point on a lot of migrations, which makes this a very popular park for bird watching. In the spring, you'll see the shorebirds flying north. Late summer, you'll see the monarch butterflies and the dragonflies. And come autumn, enormous flocks of birds are passing overhead, so many that since 1967, the Cape May Raptor Banding Project has been capturing, tagging, and releasing falcons and hawks, even eagles, to track their populations. They tag some 2,500 birds every year. Now, I have to say, the bird on the screen I actually photographed a few years back at a Native American Arts Festival. It was part of a hunting demonstration. But a couple of years ago, summertime, I drove out to visit Waterloo Village, which is in Alamuchi Mountain State Park. We'll see it a little later in the program. As I was walking back to the parking lot, I saw this one on top of a post. And for a while, it was so still, I thought it was just a sculpture or decoration, until it turned to look at me, or more accurately, turned to look right through me. One of the more unusual state parks is called Corson's Inlet. I say it's unusual because it's divided in half by the inlet that it's named for. So the northern part of the park is at the south end of Ocean City, while the southern part of the park is in the town of Strathmere. You can walk between them on the highway bridge in the background. Summertime, you'll often find people fishing this inlet. There are 2 different stories about where the inlet got its name. They both involve a pair of brothers, John and Peter Corson, who worked in the whaling industry of the late 1600s. By some accounts, the brothers simply established a whaling camp on the inlet. But the more popular story, especially in that part of the state, is that they were part of the crew of a whaling ship, and that they were such troublemakers, their captain stranded them on the inlet. Either way, it's been Corson's Inlet ever since. The largest of the state parks on the shore is called Island Beach, just south of Seaside. It's the longest stretch of undeveloped coastline in the state, about 10 miles of beaches and dunes. But that name, Island Beach, well, that's not really accurate. It has not been an island since 1812, when the inlet separating it from the rest of the long, narrow Barnegat Peninsula filled in with sand. This is a view from the state park looking north along the peninsula. And I keep this in the program, even though it's rather outdated now. This is a pre-Sandy photograph, because in the distance you can still see the amusement piers at Seaside Heights, which were completely destroyed by that storm in October of 2012. But before the shore was so heavily built up, it was very common for these inlets to fill with sand, to reopen during storms, or even to gradually shift north or south along the coast. And the inlet that used to separate Island Beach was called Cranberry Inlet, because the captains of sailing ships would anchor there to buy barrels of cranberries from the farmers in the Pine Barrens. Cranberries being one of the only things they knew of that could prevent scurvy on a long ocean voyage. Now, we still have cranberry farms in that part of the state. In fact, the one on the screen is located in another of our state parks, which has maybe my favorite name for a New Jersey state park, Double Trouble. And the name goes back to the 1700s, when a farmer who owned the property built a dam across one of the waterways. Twice in one season, floods washed it out. So he called the spot Double Trouble, and the name stuck. The building in the background is part of the park's historic village. It was built in the early 1900s as the packing and sorting house for the Double Trouble Cranberry Company. The machine in front of the porch is used for the annual harvests. Most years there is a working farm in the park, and if you visit early to mid-October, you might be there in time to see the harvest. Of course, despite what you might have seen on television commercials for cranberry juice, cranberries are not grown in water up to your waist. They're grown in the bogs, but they're grown on dry land. The bogs are only flooded at harvest time because ripe cranberries float, which makes them easier to pick. But if we head back out to Island Beach, when I first started researching and writing and speaking about local history, I was looking into the history of the Jersey Shore. And I was mostly interested in how the shore developed, how a lot of the towns got started. Here we are at the top of Barnegat Light, looking out over Barnegat Light State Park and the north end of Long Beach Island. But down at Island Beach, it was actually the opposite story that unfolded. 1926, a man named Henry Phipps. He was a former business partner of Andrew Carnegie, part owner of United States Steel. After selling his interest in the steel company, he bought all of Island Beach. And with his business manager, Francis Parkman Freeman, he was planning on turning it into a very exclusive resort, all big estates and mansions. They called the place the Borough of Island Beach, mapped it out, and even managed to lease a few of the properties. But remember the year they bought it, 1926. 3 years later, the market crashed, and that really put an end to their plans. So development mostly ended at Seaside Park, which you can see in the distance here. This is the view looking north from the bay side of Island Beach. New Jersey acquired the property for a park in 1953 and opened to the public in 1959. At that time, the state made an agreement with a few people that had already leased properties that they could use that property the rest of their life, but at that time it would revert to the state. I believe it's all state property now, but as I was exploring the trails a few years ago, there were still signs identifying some of the old leases, and one of the only homes that was ever built out there is now owned by the state and serves as a summer home for New Jersey governors. Well, if we take a trip across the state, we'll come to what some people call New Jersey's other shore, and that's the shoreline of Delaware Bay, where just below the mouth of the Delaware River, you'll find Fort Mott State Park. Not surprisingly, it's named after an actual fort that was built there in the 1890s to defend the entrance to the river, which was lined with major industrial cities like Philadelphia, Trenton, Camden, with factories and shipyards. But this was a very unusual fort. It was built into a hillside. So from out on the bay, you wouldn't see a fort. You would just see the hillside. In fact, you wouldn't even see the guns because they were raised and lowered with steam engines. They could hit a ship up to 8 miles away, but they were never fired except for target practice, and they were removed in the 1920s. New Jersey acquired the property for a park in the early 1940s, and these days you can take self-guided tours of the grounds and, when it's open, of the fort itself. Mostly concrete tunnels dug into the hillside. And if wandering through those old concrete tunnels, especially on as gloomy a day as it was when I got down there, if that's not spooky enough for you, most summers they've got ferries that leave from the dock in the park, and they'll take you out to the island you see across the top of the screen, Pea Patch Island. 1859, the government built a fort out there. It was called Fort Delaware. And during the Civil War, it was used as a prison. So to this day, a lot of people believe that that island and the fort are haunted by the ghosts of Confederate soldiers who died out there. Today, all of our state parks, as well as the state forests and certain natural and historic sites, are managed by the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, NJDEP for short, created on the first Earth Day in the early 1970s. They maintain a very extensive website with a page for each of their properties, and that's really the best place to go if you're looking for basic information on the parks, hours, fees, and especially right now with all of the closures and uncertainty, what's open, what activities are available or allowed right now. It's also a good place to download basic maps of the parks. Even before the closures of the past year, due to budget cuts, many of the parks did not have full-time offices, and I often found it difficult to get a map when I was in the parks. And if you have a sense of direction like mine, you need all the help you can get. One of the forerunners of the NJDEP was the Forest Park Reservation Commission. This was created very early in the 20th century during the term of Governor Edward Stokes. Stokes State Forest was named after him in 1907. But despite its name, the commission was not originally concerned with parks. Oh, you were welcome to visit the forests. You could go hiking or camping, hunting, fishing. But the real purpose of this commission was to preserve the woodlands for the lumber industry. They spent most of their time fighting and trying to prevent the fires that were destroying thousands of acres every year. Finally got into the park business in 1914. And this is a major region. That's Swartzwood Lake. It's out in western Sussex County. By the late 1800s, it was the center of a popular summer resort. There were picnic groves on the lake shore, summer homes and hotels in the hills around the lake, and people would come to spend the day on the water, swimming, boating, fishing. But in 1888, Andrew Albright owned a saddle factory in Newark, built himself a big lakefront estate. And according to his property title, he had also purchased all of the land underneath the lake. So he began charging people to use his lake, $1 a day. That might be a bargain today, but it was a lot of money back in the 1880s. And if you wouldn't pay up, he would take you to court. And he was winning these cases. So in 1907, the state passed a law allowing the Forest Park Reservation Commission to buy freshwater lakes and ponds and some of the surrounding property to develop as parks. Using this law, the commission bought Swartzwood from Mr. Albright's heirs in 1914 and opened it up later that year as our very first state park. It's grown quite a bit since then. One of the picnic groves on the lakeshore was owned by a man named George Emmons. He donated the property to the state a few years later. That section is still called Emmons Grove today. And a lot of our parks were developed during the Great Depression, 1930s, early 1940s, as part of President Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, trying to pump money back into the economy, trying to get people back to work. One of the New Deal agencies was called the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. And WPA workers actually dug all 3 of the lakes for a park in central New Jersey that's named after a creek flowing down to Raritan Bay. Well, sort of. Actually, the Lenape name did not originally describe the creek. It referred to the settlements they had in the hills alongside the creek. So the name meant something like Upland Village or Upland People. If they had had a written language, the park's name might have been spelled like this: Big problem with not having a written language? Somebody else puts your words down on paper. And it seems some of our ancestors had some strange ideas about spelling. Cheesequake means absolutely nothing, but it does give you something to chuckle about driving the Garden State Parkway. The park was established in 1938. When the parkway was built in the mid-1950s, it runs right through the center of Cheesequake State Park. But although this work was done by the WPA, most of the work in parks and forests around the nation was done by another New Deal agency, the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. And this was modeled after a program that Roosevelt had tried a few years earlier when he was governor of the state of New York, designed to provide temporary employment for young men, ages 18 to 24. They would be enlisted for 6 months at a time, but could remain on the job up to 2 years. Now, remember that it was the 1930s and the depths of the Depression when I tell you that they were paid about $30 a month. Out of that $30, about $25 was sent home to their families. While you served in the Corps, you lived in camps set up almost like military bases, so not a lot of need for spending money. But by the middle of the 1930s, the Corps was employing 500,000 men at 2,600 camps all across the United States. 22 of those were here in New Jersey, including one way down near the city of Vineland in Parvin State Park. Now, Parvin Lake had been a privately owned lake resort, but in the 1920s, the second generation owner, he speculated a little too heavily in the stocks. After the market crashed, he was deeply in debt, and the only way he could see to get out was to sell the property. Well, we didn't have any state parks down that way, so the state government bought it from him. And the CCC did a lot of work in this park. They rebuilt the dam. The original dated back to the 1780s. It's what created the lake in the first place. They also built bridges over the park's waterways. This one has always been called the White Bridge. They built the park's picnic shelters. They built the rental cabins, still in use. And they even built the main entranceway and bathhouses on the lakeshore. This building was also an early attempt at recycling. All of the brick they used had been salvaged from some buildings that had just been demolished out in Philadelphia. In the early 1940s, CCC workers also dug a second lake for the park. This one is called Thundergust Lake. Another of the camps was located in northern Hunterdon County in Voorhees State Park. And if you visit Voorhees State Park, if you climb to the top of the highest and steepest trail in that park, you'll come across a pair of stone armchairs, which do not look very inviting in a photograph. But I have to say, when I got to the top of that trail, I was glad to find these. Now, the property started out as a farm called Hill Acres, owned by a man named Foster Voorhees. Left it to the state in his will in 1927. But back in 1899, Foster Voorhees was elected governor of New Jersey. And shortly after taking office, he received a petition from the New Jersey Federation of Women's Clubs, asking him to find a way to save the Palisades, the cliffs running along the Hudson River. Quarry companies were blasting away at these cliffs, removing thousands of tons of rock a day that they were going to crush to pave the streets of New York City, which was growing rapidly. Well, there was no agency yet for creating state parks. Governor Voorhees knew it would be very expensive to try to buy out the quarries, and he didn't expect to get any political support for that in the southern part of the state. Luckily, New York had also elected a new governor that year. Theodore Roosevelt was just back from leading the Rough Riders in the Spanish-American War, and he would soon become William McKinley's vice president. Working together, the two governors created the Palisades Interstate Park Commission. And with a donation from one of their wealthy friends, the banker J.P. Morgan, they were able to buy out the largest of the quarries on Christmas Eve, 1900. 9 years later, the commission opened up the main part of Palisades Interstate Park. 14 miles, runs from Fort Lee to just over the New York state line. In the following decades, the commission would buy up a lot of other properties in New York to develop as parks, including Bear Mountain and Harriman State Parks. Well, the Palisades were not the only New Jersey landmark that had to be saved from a quarry company. Spring of 1777, George Washington camped his army in the Hopatcong Mountains. It wasn't a very large army, so he was hoping to avoid battle in the coming months. But to do that, he needed to know where the British were and what they were doing. So at the base of the mountains, he met a group of farmers and asked if they knew of a spot that he could use as a lookout. One of them said he knew the perfect spot. So Washington loaned him one of his officers' horses, followed him up a winding trail to the top of a mountain where there were two large rock outcrops. From the bigger of the two, Washington could see miles in every direction. After the war, that became known as Washington Rock. The smaller rock nearby they called Lafayette Rock because the Marquis had been traveling with the army that summer. Throughout the 19th century, Washington Rock was painted white so you could see it from quite a distance. The area around it became popular for picnics, patriotic holidays, political rallies, but by the early 1900s, quarry company was chipping away at the hill below the rock. So a local family bought the land from the quarry, resold it to the state for $1. 1913, the Daughters of the American Revolution used the rubble from the quarry to build this wall connecting the two rocks. They also built the flagpole monument up above. The base of that monument had been started decades earlier by another organization. It was going to be some kind of memorial tower, but they ran out of money, so it never happened. Eventually, the land became part of the state park system as Washington Rock State Park, one of 4 of our state parks celebrating New Jersey's role in the American Revolution. Some historians call our state the crossroads of the Revolution, and they've calculated that there were more battles and skirmishes and naval engagements fought in and around New Jersey than in any of the other colonies. This is the Washington Crossing Bridge over the Delaware River, about 9 miles north of Trenton. Steel bridge opened up in 1904, but the stone piers supporting it, well, they were built back in 1832 to carry a wooden covered bridge. There are parks at both ends of this bridge. I took this picture from the Pennsylvania side in Washington Crossing Historic Park. The building is McConkey's Ferry Inn. Mr. McConkey ran the ferry boats across that part of the Delaware. George Washington used the inn as a watch post for a few weeks in December of 1776 and dined there with his officers on Christmas night before making his famous crossing of the river. Now, 1776 had not been a great year for George Washington or the Continental Army. Well, they lost Long Island. They lost Manhattan, New York City. They then had to retreat across New Jersey, what was left of the army, about 3,000 men. They then crossed the Delaware into Pennsylvania and established winter quarters along 30 miles of the west bank of the river. To keep the British from following, Washington made sure that all the boats on the New Jersey side were either hidden or sunk. Well, maybe he didn't have to go to that much effort. The British had no intention of fighting in winter. They settled into winter quarters, left a force of Hessian troops to guard the nearby town of Trenton, and they figured that the winter itself should be enough to wipe out Washington's army. And there was good reason to believe that. Most of the men in the army, their enlistments were due to run out on December 31st, and they were ready to go home. So to keep the army together, to pursue the war in the following year, Washington knew he needed to inspire the men. He needed a victory. So he pulled in reinforcements from Pennsylvania, from up in New England, and worked out a plan that on Christmas night, they would divide into 3 groups, cross the Delaware under cover of darkness, land in New Jersey, and then march down the riverbank to Trenton, arriving before dawn, and they would capture the city from the Hessians. Well, nothing went quite the way they were planning. A snowstorm blew in, the river was freezing. Only one of the 3 groups successfully landed in New Jersey. Not surprisingly, that was the one led by Washington himself. Where they landed is now Washington Crossing State Park, which has some walking trails, small Revolutionary War museum, a couple of historic ferry buildings. What you see here on the screen is a modern reproduction of one of the wooden ferries. They keep several others on the Pennsylvania side because most years they do stage a reenactment of the crossing on Christmas, weather permitting. and this past year it was canceled due to the virus. Doesn't look much like the boat in the famous painting, but then most historians will agree that the only thing accurate about this painting was the fact that the river was freezing that night. So they still had to march 9 miles through a snowstorm, dragging their cannons. They did not reach Trenton before sunrise, but they still managed to take the Hessians completely by surprise. Nobody was expecting an attack the morning after Christmas during a snowstorm. Also, the Hessians had not bothered to fortify a strategic hill, even though the British had left instructions to do that. So Washington put his guns up there instead, fired them down into the town. It was a short battle. It was an American victory. He quickly moved the army back across the Delaware into Pennsylvania. In 1893, the Trenton Battle Monument was built to mark the site where he had those guns. Although it's about 9 miles from Washington Crossing State Park, it is preserved as part of the park. At the top of the column, there's a 13-foot bronze statue of Washington giving the order to fire those cannons. And the man in charge of the guns that morning was a very young Alexander Hamilton. Well, from Trenton, or Washington Crossing, it's only a short drive up to Princeton Battlefield State Park. These columns are all that remain of a mansion that used to stand there, burned down in the 1950s. Well, after the victory at Trenton, Washington offered his troops an extra $10 a man, a lot of money in those days, offered it out of his own personal fortune, if they would stay and fight just another 6 weeks. Most of them accepted, so early in the new year, Washington launched another surprise attack, this time on the British garrison defending Princeton. It was another short battle, another American victory. Now, when they had set out that morning, Washington was considering marching all the way to New Brunswick to try to capture the British supplies stored there. After the fighting at Princeton, decided not to push his luck, instead turned the army north toward Morristown, where they established new winter quarters, and some of that property is now maintained by the National Park Service. At Princeton, a lot of the fighting took place within sight of Thomas Clark's farmhouse. This is now a Revolutionary War museum, because this is where the injured soldiers from both armies were treated after the battle. One of the men who was brought here after the fighting, but soon died of his injuries, was the American General Hugh Mercer. Story goes that after being bayoneted by British soldiers, he refused to be taken from the battlefield until the fighting was done. He wanted to stay with the troops. So they say he rested under a large oak tree. That became known as the Mercer Oak and remained standing until about 15 years ago, when it was blown over in a windstorm. But the general isn't forgotten. Mercer County, New Jersey is named after him, and these early victories did not go unnoticed overseas. Over the next few years, a group of European military officers sailed across to offer their expertise to Washington's army. One of those was the Prussian Baron von Steuben, and he's the man who, during the winter the army spent out in Valley Forge, trained the American officers to then train the troops to maneuver more like a European army, to charge with bayonets. The idea being that we might finally face the British on the open battlefield, rather than relying on these surprise attacks and clever retreats. You'll find this statue right outside the Visitors Center at Monmouth Battlefield State Park, because that's where his training was put to the test in June of 1778. The Visitors Center is on top of a hill, overlooking the farms and fields and orchards where the battle was fought. Late in the afternoon, the American General Nathaniel Greene moved 4 guns to the hilltop. With those, he was able to drive the British artillery off the field, which opened the way for an American infantry attack. And late in the day, the British retreated back to their camp. Now, they could have waited there until morning to resume the fighting, but the British had already been marching across New Jersey when Washington's army caught up with them at Monmouth. The British were headed for Sandy Hook, where their fleet was waiting. So that night, the British left their campfires burning, so it would look like they were still in camp, and then as quietly as possible resumed the march to Sandy Hook. And that night, the larger part of the British army left New Jersey, never to return, making Monmouth the last major battle in our state, although fighting did continue until the early 1780s. The battle at Monmouth took place on a very hot afternoon. The men were dropping from heat exhaustion. So luckily for some of the American troops, it was fairly common in those days for soldiers' wives to travel with the armies. One of the American gunners was named William Hayes. His wife's name was probably Mary, but most people used her nickname. They called her Molly. And she found a spring on the battlefield. It's marked within the park. And the men would call out to her, "Molly, bring the pitcher." Well, some historians say she was probably using a bucket, not a pitcher, but Molly Bucket just doesn't have the same ring to it. The reason she's remembered is that after her husband was injured, she took his place at the cannon. And when the fighting was over, George Washington himself commended her for her bravery. Now, some of those farms and orchards are still in operation, even though they're part of the state park. And throughout the year, visitors can go there to pick their own apples, peaches, strawberries, even pumpkins in season. But during the Revolution, New Jersey was not only the site of battles and retreats. At iron forges, like this one near the shore of Lake Wayway, this is where they made cannonballs and weapons and tools and other things the Army needed. And in northern New Jersey, you've got veins of iron ore that parallel the mountain ranges. Some of the veins may stretch for miles, others may be only a few feet wide. People began looking for them starting in the late 1600s. They would do that by digging shafts down into the mountain. If they hit a vein, they then had to tunnel in from the side of the mountain to dig out the ore. Well, that's why in colonial and revolutionary days, a lot of the iron used in New Jersey came from the central part of the state, down in the Pine Barrens, where a lot of the rivers and streams and bogs were fed by spring water. And there was so much iron dissolved in that spring water that when it mixed with the clay and sand of the river banks, it formed lumps of what they called bog iron. Nowhere near as pure as what you could dig out of the mountains. It was only about 30% iron, but it was easy to find. You could pick it up by hand, no tunneling into mountains, and it was a renewable resource. Every 25, 30 years, you could go back to the same areas and find fresh deposits forming. Now, to remove the iron from the ore, you had to heat it to about 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, the molten iron, which was very heavy, would separate and sink to the bottom of the furnace, leaving the lighter impurities, what they called slag, floating on top. Twice a day, they'd skim off the slag so they could collect the valuable iron. Well, to maintain those temperatures, you had to keep the furnaces burning 24 hours a day. That's why, until coal was discovered out in Pennsylvania, thousands of acres of New Jersey's forests, including most of the woods in Sussex County, were cut and burned to make charcoal for the iron industry. The furnace on the screen was built in the 1790s and is preserved as part of the historic village in Elaire State Park. The park is named after James Peter Elaire, who had a steam engine factory in New York City. In order to have a steady supply of iron, he bought the forge and about 10,000 acres of the surrounding bogs and forests, but then realized that the land was so far from any established city or town, he needed to build his own. He built brick row houses for the workers. This is the only one still standing. It's now the park office and museum. He also built a church and a school, a company store that was once the largest retail building in the state. This now runs as the general store in the historic village, which also has a working bakery and a blacksmith shop. Now, Mr. Elaire left very little to chance. He had his own stagecoach line, so he could move the ore from his furnace up to the depots at Eatontown and Red Bank. Later on, he even had his own steamships to run it up to New York City. But by the 1840s, he was having a hard time competing with cheaper ore coming from northern New Jersey, from out in Pennsylvania, from along the shores of the Great Lakes. So when he retired in 1850, he shut down the whole operation. After he died in 1858, one of his sons lived there alone for several decades. Now, as the surrounding areas began to develop, people started calling this land the abandoned village. It was purchased in 1907 by Arthur Brisbane, very popular syndicated newspaper columnist. He eventually leased some of it to the local Boy Scouts who did the first restoration work on the old buildings. And in 1941, his widow donated the property to the state for a park. Now, it was possible here in New Jersey to make your fortune in the iron industry. Well, Peter Cooper did. He was a businessman, philanthropist, inventor. He built the United States' first steam locomotive back in 1830, called it the Tom Thumb. And he built it to convince the owners of the new Baltimore and Ohio Railroad that they should use locomotives instead of horses to pull their train cars. To prove the point, they set up a race. The Tom Thumb won. Peter Cooper made a fortune selling the B&O iron rails. In 1853, he bought the mines in Ringwood, New Jersey, with his business partner, Abram Hewitt. Mr. Hewitt was later elected mayor of New York City. The mines had been in operation for more than a century, had several owners during those years. During the Revolution, the mines were owned by Robert Erskine. He helped forge part of a giant chain used to block the Hudson River. And because he was good friends with George Washington, he also drew hundreds of maps for him during the Revolution. Early 1800s, the property was bought by Martin Ryerson, who built himself a 10-room manor house. Well, in 1855, Abram Hewitt married Peter Cooper's only daughter. Her name was Sarah. They moved into the old manor house and decided to enlarge it, just a little. By the time their heirs gave the house to the state, it had 51 rooms, 24 fireplaces, and well over 200 windows. When they reopened for tours, it's a very interesting house to walk through. Because it was built over a long period of time, the architecture and the interior design changed quite a bit from room to room or section to section. Sarah was also very interested in gardening, so behind the house you can see some of the gardens she designed. They're decorated with sculptures and statues she and Abram collected during their travels around the world. And if you enjoy visiting either mansions or gardens, you'll need to spend a little bit longer at Ringwood State Park, because in 1891, Francis Lind Stetson, he was J.P. Morgan's personal lawyer, built himself a mountaintop estate that he called Skylands Farms. 1922, his widow sold the property to investment banker Charles Mackenzie Lewis, who built himself a 45-room mansion there, which he called Skylands Manor. Because it looked like a castle, he decorated the inside with antique paneling he brought over from England and 400-year-old stained glass windows he got in Germany. Today, it's a popular site for weddings and other special occasions. But Mr. Lewis was also very interested in gardening. He was a trustee of the New York Botanical Garden, and he spent 30 years collecting trees and plants from all over the world for his property. At one point, he had 60 gardeners working there. Well, New Jersey acquired the land as part of Ringwood State Park in the 1960s, and in 1984, Governor Thomas Kean dedicated part of it as the New Jersey Botanical Garden. The iron from the Ringwood mines was processed nearby at what's now Long Pond Iron Works State Park. Long Pond was the colonial name for Greenwood Lake. In the park, the old ironmaster's house, the home of the man who ran the operation, has been restored as a museum describing the northern New Jersey iron industry. But that's also the starting point for about a mile-long trail winding through the woods of the park. Along the trail, you see what's left of various structures related to the iron industry, including this old water wheel and the ruins of 3 stone furnaces that were used up until the late 1800s. One was built in the late 1700s, the other 2 built around the time of the Civil War. Local legend has it that at least one of them was dynamited in 1917 to create a spectacular ending for a silent movie. That's when the movie industry was still headquartered in Fort Lee on the Palisades. Now, one of the big challenges for the iron industry, especially in the northern part of the state, was the cost and the difficulty of moving the ore from those mountaintop mines down to the industrial cities. You had to load it into wagons, which were then pulled over really bad roads by teams of horses or oxen. Things did start to improve in the 1830s. Morris Canal opened in 1831, running all the way from Phillipsburg on the Delaware River to Jersey City on the Hudson. 3 years later, the Delaware and Raritan Canal opened. Main line of the canal ran from Trenton up to New Brunswick, but the canal actually started about 20 miles north of Trenton, where water from the Delaware River was let into a narrow canal. They called it a feeder canal. A series of locks raised the water up to the canal's summit at Trenton, about 58 feet above sea level. From there, the canal ran roughly northeast across New Jersey, descending through another series of locks until it reached the Raritan River at New Brunswick. And today, except for a small section that was paved over in Trenton in the 1930s, the entire canal is preserved as Delaware and Raritan Canal State Park. Most of the park is only as wide as the canal and the old tow path running alongside of it. That's where the mules would walk to tow the canal boats at a top speed of 4 miles an hour. Along that path, you can still see the old stone mile markers. There is a different number on each side because the distances are measured from both ends of the canal, parts of which are still used to bring reservoir water to towns along its route. Morris Canal was a little more unusual. It drew most of its water from Lake Hopatcong, where you'll find yet another state park with a Lenape name. If you believe this 1905 tourist guide, the writer claimed that Hopatcong was an old Indian word meaning honey water of many coves. Yeah, that was dreamed up by somebody who wanted to sell lakefront property. Historians say the name actually refers to a type of stone in the area. It's a soft stone. Its modern name is soapstone, but the Lenape carved pipes from it. So in their language, Hopatcong meant pipestone. Because this canal crossed northern New Jersey, it had to climb mountains. From the Delaware River up to the lake, climbed 760 feet. From the lake down to sea level at Newark and Jersey City, 914-foot drop. Canal was barely 100 miles long, and the locks they had in those days could only raise or lower a boat 20 feet. So along the Morris Canal, the boats were towed up and down hills on rails. They called these inclined planes, and there were 23 of them on the canal. The longest was 1,800 feet long and raised boats 100 feet. They needed special boats to use these planes. They were built in 2 watertight halves hinged in the middle. That way, when you reached the top of the plane, you could gently lower the boat back into the water without breaking the keel. Well, those boats were up to 87 feet long and carried 70 tons of cargo. And they moved everything from passengers and fresh produce to manufactured goods. But both of the canals depended very heavily on the iron industry. They moved ore, they moved coal, and by the 1870s, the canals were losing most of that business to the new railroads. One train could move a lot more, could move it a lot faster and a lot cheaper than any number of canal boats. Now, for a while, the owners of the Morris Canal and Banking Company, tried to ignore that. They made plans to enlarge the canal to compete with the railroads. When they realized that was a lost cause, they made plans to enlarge the canal, this time to serve as a water supply for Jersey City. Well, that fell through too, and probably just as well, because like several of the other lakes we visited, Hopatcong was the center of a summer resort industry. And if you enlarge the canal, you'd be drawing a lot more water from the lake, which would have killed off most of that industry. So one of the major property owners up there, he owned 3 miles of lakefront, was a man named Hudson Maxim. This was a pier that used to be in his estate. He had made his fortune in the explosives industry, eventually sold his patents to the DuPont company. And he was concerned that the lake would be destroyed. So in 1913, he wrote and self-published a book called Lake Hopatcong the Beautiful, in which he urged the state of New Jersey to shut down that canal and take over the lake for a park. Well, it's hard to say just how influential his book was. To give you an example of his writing style, he titled one chapter, the utter insignificance of the Morris Canal as a coal carrier. But the canal was closed down in the 1920s. New Jersey did establish a state park at one end of the lake. Most of the canal was drained and filled in. This is all that's left of one of the locks near Stevens State Park in western Morris County. There's only a few short sections of the canal left that still have water flowing. One of them is in Hopatcong State Park, just below the dam. Right alongside there, you'll see the old lockkeeper's house. It's now a Morris Canal Museum. The company provided housing for those keepers because they were on duty from 5 in the morning until 9 at night, 6 days a week. The canal was closed on Sundays. Another section runs through Alamucci Mountain State Park. This is where the canal passed Waterloo Village. The building on the right was the store, and you can see that it opened up right onto the canal. You also had an old mill there. Waterloo used to be a very interesting attraction. They gave guided tours of these buildings and some of the old homes there. Unfortunately, some time back, the state got the idea of letting the place be privately run. That really didn't work, so eventually it was closed down and stayed closed for years. Well, a couple of summers ago, I saw that they were reopened. What that meant, they reopened the grounds. You're able to walk around again, but most of the buildings are still closed up and awaiting renovation. One of the few that is still well maintained and even open occasionally is the Museum of the Canal Society of New Jersey. The society also gives occasional tours of the park. The last section of the canal that still has water flowing is the eastern end of it, where it meets the Hudson River at Jersey City. And this was a wide section of the canal, what they called a basin, where they could turn around those 87-foot boats. It also forms the waterway along the northern edge of Liberty State Park. And most of Liberty State Park is built on landfill that was dumped in the Hudson in the 19th century by 3 companies: the Morris Canal and Banking Company, the Central Railroad of New Jersey, which built this terminal building there in 1886, and finally the Lehigh Valley Railroad. In the early 20th century, Lehigh Valley Railroad had a mile-long pier in what's now the southern part of the park. The pier completely covered a small island called Black Tom Island. Historians say the name probably refers to a fisherman who used to live there. In this old postcard of Ellis Island, you can see the pier stretching out behind it. Well, summer of 1916. World War I is raging in Europe, but the United States is still officially neutral. Lehigh Valley Railroad, they were storing 1 million tons of high explosives on the pier, which were going to be shipped to the Allies. Except that on July 30th at 2 o'clock in the morning, the 1 million tons of explosives did more or less what they were designed to do. The blast killed 7 people. Windows shattered for miles around. The shock was felt as far away as Philadelphia. Closer to home, shrapnel punctured the arm of the Statue of Liberty, and the shock caused the stone ceiling of the Great Hall on Ellis Island to collapse. Fortunately, the islands, there was nobody out there. It was the middle of the night, but they were kept empty until the fires were put out on shore. The investigation dragged on into the 1950s, when the explosion was finally blamed on German sabotage. Today, there's a circle of flags and a plaque in the southern part of the park marking the site of the Black Tom explosion. If you wanted to ride a train through one of the state parks, spend a little longer down at Elaire State Park, where the New Jersey Museum of Transportation operates the Pine Creek Railroad. Pine Creek was started in the 1950s outside of the park by a private company, and they were buying and restoring old locomotives and passenger cars and running them on a half-mile track. One locomotive you will not find there is the very first one that they restored. They sold that in the 1960s to Walt Disney, and it is still running out in California. And when some of New Jersey's railroads were no longer needed, the tracks were removed and the roadbeds were converted to multi-use trails. They call these rail trails. And they're quite popular for walking, sometimes for riding bikes, even riding horses. Part of what makes them so popular is they're very easy trails. The railroad had already created a level roadbed, so you're not climbing mountains on these. And several of them cross parts of our state parks. This is the Sussex Branch Trail. It's 20 miles long. It follows the route of the Sussex Branch Railroad that Abram Hewitt started in the early 1850s to bring iron ore from the Andover mines down to Waterloo Village. So this trail runs through both Alamuchee Mountain State Park and Kittatinny Valley. Kittatinny also manages the 27-mile Paulinskill Valley Trail. That follows the route of the old New York, Susquehanna, and Western Railroad across Sussex County. The trail is named after the Paulinskill River, which it mostly follows, although it also crosses the river a few times on old railroad bridges, including this one near Blairstown. And if you follow either of these trails far enough north, they cross at Sparta Junction, northern Sussex County. Well, with one last view of one of the lakes up at High Point, this brings us to the end of our trip through the state parks. Hope I've given you at least a little glimpse of the history of our state. And also, now that the weather is starting to warm up, maybe the snow is going away, reason to get out and do some exploring. A lot of history in these parks, and also just a chance to see what a beautiful state we really have here. I'd like to thank everybody for watching. If you visit my website, which is simply kevinwoyce.com, you will find a full schedule of when I'm speaking, which topics I'm speaking about. You can also follow me on Facebook at Kevin Woyce Author or Instagram at Kevin Woyce. And on the website, you can find information and links for the books that I've written and illustrated, mostly regional history topics, including the state parks, the Jersey Shore, the Statue of Liberty, and those are available in both paperbacks and ebooks. Once again, I'd like to thank everybody for watching. Thank you.